there's so much focus on what's happening in Gaza, but it seems to be a steady escalation as well in the West Bank of a whole range of activities, from arrests to assassinations. So maybe you could just give us a capsule view from where you're sitting of what's happening there in the West Bank and what Palestinians are facing.
So in the West Bank, we're seeing a similar trend as in Gaza, and that's an escalation and emboldenment of Israeli settler violence, just because the settlers that are throwing the bombs on Gaza are in uniform does not make them separate or exclusive from the settlers around the West Bank, forcibly expelling Palestinians from their homes at gunpoint, quite literally at gunpoint, and through the reinforcement and support of one of the most technologically advanced militaries in the world. We're seeing an increase of killing of Palestinians. And again, most, like in Gaza, most are minors and children. And you'll see the type of targeted precision kill shots across the bodies of the Palestinians that are being slaughtered in the West Bank. It's very similar to Gaza, targeted and precision. It's shots to the head. It is shots to the chest. That is, if you go through the autopsy list, it is chest, head, chest, head, chest, head. And these, again, are minors, unarmed civilians, non-combatants. And like Gaza, Israel is using the same slogan that they are targeting Hamas, and they're reaching levels of just last night, or rather today at dawn hours. The Israeli military invaded Ramallah, carried out large mass-scale military incursions in different villages and cities and towns. And you need to remember the West Bank has been demilitarized since the 1990s under the Oslo Agreement. So every piece of weapon that is in the West Bank is accounted for by Israel. So to even claim the Hamas argument goes to show you how this is an attempt at justifying the slaughter of Palestinians with the aim of expelling them. We are seeing new outposts, new settlements being built, even in the middle of a war. When Israel is $8 billion in debt, they just allocated 2.3 million Israeli shekels, which is almost the equivalent of close to $600,000, $700,000 to the yeshivot in Hebron for the Israeli settlements in the middle of war when it is under debt. So you can see where they're prioritizing it as well. We're just seeing mass expulsion.
Mariam, I'm curious, there was a lot made about the fact that I think it was like yesterday or a couple days ago, the Biden administration announced that they were going to impose visa bans on settlers who were attacking Palestinians. And I'm curious your response to this. Is this actually anything that matters? Is it just something symbolic? I mean, obviously there's a lot more the U.S. could do here.
The U.S. claims to try to be non-biased and a legitimate mediator in Palestinian affairs, for that matter. But it is really just trying to buttress and reinforce Israel's dominance in the region. We have seen it with its continuous. You can't say that you will not give a visa to someone that has attacked Palestinians when you are the number one state arming the Israeli military, when you have U.S. forces on the ground actively participating in an ongoing genocide. So to claim that you are a legitimate and fair and just mediator goes to show you how the U.S. is trying to play the fields in an attempt, again, to showcase itself as the police of the world, as the only democracy in the world. And this is really criminal because what it is doing, in essence, is also privatizing weapons development companies that are Israeli, that are national Israeli companies, but they're privatizing them more and more in the United States right now. So you can't just give a policy and expect it to be enough in regards of the relationship of how much you are a part of committing the genocide.
One of the things I was hoping you could also help explain to our viewers is the issues around the, I would say massive restrictions on freedom of movement for Palestinians, in the West Bank. I mean, I know it's accelerated in the context of what's been happening since October 7th, but, it's also a constant reality, which sadly some people in the United States are trying to deny even exists.
I think the attempt to deny what is happening in Palestine is a signal of people's inability to sit with that discomfort that a genocide is happening under their watch and that they have a role in it. I think the easiest way is to deny that rather than confront it and challenge it. Ask yourself what you can do about it, and then set yourself up for failure to recognize that you might not overcome it, but that's not enough reason to ignore that it is happening, and to not participate in it actively and willfully. But I think that's also part of how the media, again, is engaging with audiences, especially in the US. I think media thinks that their audiences are either stupid or ignorant or both. And so they do not feed them with the right information. They don't give them the truth. Instead, it is these little sound bites that are dictated by editorial policies that are formulated after excessive years of consistent lobbying at a personal level. And that helps curate the narrative that Palestinians are terrorists. And it plays on American vulnerabilities throughout, after we have seen from 9/11, there was this constant buildup of vulnerability that is fed by Islamophobia. And right now, Israel is playing on these, again, memories of pain in order to further feed these vulnerabilities with the American public. And that's how the media coverage is framing everything here. Oh, this is just a fight of good versus evil, the civilized versus the savage. This is a fight to, as Netanyahu, and I quote, said, of light against darkness. And, it's kind of, it's that I guess pushes people more and more into the denialism aspect that's rooted in an inability to just get uncomfortable with what's happening.
I'm also curious if you could talk a bit about the fact that people are fighting back. There is resistance in the West Bank. Obviously, this is one of the fronts that Israel is fighting, Gaza as being the biggest one, but Israel is pretty much trying to take out anybody who's standing in its way. So I'm curious if you could talk a bit about that aspect, because I think a lot of times, people see this as obviously Israel is slaughtering civilians, but Palestinians do fight back. They protest, they resist, both nonviolently and with arms, which they have every right to. So can you, I guess, give us a bit of a breakdown of what's taking place in the West Bank on that front?
Yeah. So in the West Bank, we have actually a rise in armed resistance in the last year and a half. And just last year, the Israeli military, in coordination with its intelligence units and police, launched Operation Break the Wave, which was a series of extrajudicial assassinations. So you need to understand that when I say armed groups, these are basically small battalions of 4 or 5 youth, usually between the ages of 18 to 28, that manage to find either a gun or buy an outdated gun, and they go against this nuclear army. Mostly they come out from refugee camps like Gaza, which is 70% refugees, and to return. But there has been a complete delegitimization of these groups, recognizing that their weapons are absolutely no match at all to the Israeli military. And this is why Israel continuously targets civilians and non-combatants, because on the ground and strategically, at the level of land power, they have not really been able to break the growth of armed resistance. Instead, we saw it rise, and we saw, the growth of more organized and strategic forms of resistance. But Israel considers everything as terrorism. And right now we have armed resistance, but 2 years ago we did not. And still they put a cultural institution on the terrorist list. They put NGOs that are documenting human rights violations on the terrorist list, and then demanded that the European Union withdraw funding from these organizations. So it really shows you kind of also what Palestinians must navigate in not just surviving, but confronting.
No, I think that's a very well taken point. And, especially speaking of children and thinking about those who have been, taken captive, those who are being arrested, this huge increase we're seeing in arrest. I mean, it seems that one of the things that has been, revealed in some ways by those political prisoners have been released is, how for many young people and children, this constant criminalization is just a part of everyday life.
Absolutely. Being born Palestinian is being born under the watch of Israel from the moment you are just brought into this life, you are under the watch of Israel. Our IDs are issued by Israel. Our entry and exit as Palestinians is dictated by the Israeli authorities. How much water we have per day is dictated by the Israeli authorities. So the children experience this kind of violence at the daily level, just the inability to survive, the inability, to have nutrition. Many Palestinian children have high rates of malnutrition. Do you recognize what that does to you as a child in developmental ages? And then to experience that weakness in your body, and then witness your father being beaten in front of you because an 18-year-old soldier in the Givati brigade was bored at the checkpoint in the West Bank. And this is becoming a reoccurring story. I personally covered at least a dozen in the last year stories of Palestinian fathers being killed point blank because a soldier got pissed off at his tone, or a soldier felt irritated that the father didn't listen on his way to work, or passing through just cities going to dinners. So the children are witnessing this in the background. What does this do to a future? What does this do to a generation? It either breeds a generation that refuses to succumb and acquiesce and resist, or it'll breed a generation that is completely stunted and in shock of the violence, that they're unable to grow.
Mariam, you've been living in the West Bank for a very long time and covering this. I think you've probably seen, different Israeli leadership administrations. I think we've witnessed the Israelis go from, obviously they've always had a sort of, eliminationist mindset about Palestinians, but it seems like we've reached a new phase where you have very open genocidal rhetoric throughout the last few years, and now you see it being carried out very openly in Gaza, and a lot of that being mimicked in smaller ways in the West Bank. And I'm just curious if you feel that difference on the ground, because obviously it's always been very bad. It's always been settler colonial, but we're in a phase where it looks like an exterminationist mentality is unfolding before our eyes.
Yes, so this is not new. The genocidal statements is how the state of Israel was birthed in 1948. It was built on massacres. Although you are accurate in recognizing that this is unlike anything before, that even the trends of violence have surpassed anything in Palestinian history from the Nakba, from 1948, which is considered the epitome of the Palestinian condition and reality. But right now, what we are seeing is it's not the genocidal statements. They had set the intentions in the last 5 years, and Palestinians appealed very loudly in 2021 in the uprising of unity and hope. They pled very loudly from all over Palestine, Palestinians with Israeli citizenship in Gaza, in the West Bank, and those and Syrians in the occupied Golan Heights came together in a mass protest saying Israel is reaching levels that are unprecedented. We have mobs yelling death to Arabs. We have the police shooting us point blank. And 50 Palestinians killed wasn't enough. 60 Palestinians killed wasn't enough. And every year just kept going on the rise. And now Israel, the Palestinians said they are testing your limits. It is clear that the word's limit is beyond genocide.
It's quite the moment to be in, but we were very, very happy to have you help come join us and illuminate some of these points more greatly. Mariam Barghouti, journalist and policy analyst based in Ramallah. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Well, Eugene, I'm not sure. I think that I'm not sure if people saw the opening because may have been a glitch in YouTube. So I just want to reiterate the fact that the Israelis murdered the Palestinian academic, wonderful professor, wonderful writer, Rafiq ElAri, and we just heard the news of this evening. Those who are close to him are calling it an assassination. I genuinely do believe that Israel is hunting these people. Rafiq is somebody who was speaking very prolifically about what was happening in Gaza. He stayed in North Gaza as long as he could with his family. I think ultimately he did make it down to the south, so I'm not sure what the details of his murder are. So that means he has joined the other, some 20,000 Palestinians murdered, and today marks 2 months since this campaign of extermination in Gaza began unfolding. And I just want to say that, one of his last tweet on his Twitter page. His last tweet says, "The Democratic Party and Biden are responsible for the Gaza genocide perpetrated by Israel." I want to say that again. The Democratic Party and Biden are responsible for the Gaza genocide perpetrated on Israel. He tweeted that on December 4th. So that was 3 days ago. And now this person, this wonderful, wonderful person, who, by the way, taught at universities in Gaza and taught about the Holocaust and taught what we need to learn from that. This is a person who, he literally taught against anti-Semitism in Gaza, and the Israelis murdered him. It's like beyond words, but I just want those are his last words on Twitter at least. And I really encourage people to go check out all of the live streams he's been a part of on Electronic Intifada. He was on one very recently, I think within the last week. Go listen to this man's words. Go listen to his words. There was this exchange he had with Ali Abu Nima when this first started. I think it was like less than 1,000 had been killed by then, but hundreds had, many of them children. And it was clear this was not going to end for a while and the slaughter was going to get worse. And Ali got very emotional. And he said something along the lines of, "We have failed you. We have failed you." And Rifat smiled and said, "No, you haven't failed us. The world is watching Gaza. The world is talking about Gaza. So please, for the sake of him and all the other 20,000 people who've been murdered in this genocide and the thousands more that probably will be, do not stop talking about Gaza. Do not stop telling everybody you know that the United States of America is funding and arming a genocide, the worst genocide of this century in Gaza. And it is in our power as Americans to make it stop."
Well, I think that is very well said, and it sadly speaks to the next story we want to turn to, which is America absolutely trying to send more money to buy more weapons to Israel, as well as Ukraine and other things to continue certainly the slaughter in Gaza, among many other conflicts. And we are very, very happy to be joined here once again by Walter Smolarek, who is the editor of Liberation News, to discuss this. Walter, thanks so much for being back with us.
Thank you for having me back.
Well, as you know, I don't know if everyone pays attention to the back and forth in Congress on a daily basis, but yesterday, of course, the massive package that's supposed to fund war in Israel, Ukraine, and the South China Sea failed over some other issues. But maybe first and foremost, before we get into the politics of it, Walter, if you could just give us some brief view of what this supplemental budget contains, what they're trying to push through.
That's right. It's all of the worst, most evil, murderous priorities of the U.S. empire packaged together into one piece of legislation. And then, if that wasn't enough, they added on top of that, the politicians in Congress added on top of that billions of dollars for anti-immigrant repression, for militarization along the U.S.-Mexico border. So the largest chunk of this supplemental bill, what they're calling a supplementary defense spending bill, would go to Ukraine. The exact numbers are still in flux, but approaching $70 billion would be spent providing more and more weaponry to Ukraine to keep the proxy war going. When it comes to Israel's genocide in Gaza, which is really a U.S.-Israeli genocide, the bill would allocate over $14 billion. Over $14 billion on top of the $3.8 billion that's already given on a regular basis every year to Israel in weaponry. And then there's some number of billions of dollars for Taiwan to pump up the new Cold War with China. The language they're using on that is a little opaque, but at least $2 billion for military weaponry, for funding to Taiwan, which China and almost every country on earth recognizes as being part of China. And then, because there is this current in the Republican Party that is opposed to or postures as being opposed to the proxy war in Ukraine, at least rhetorically, there's this other provision where many billions of additional dollars, about $8 billion, would be directed towards ICE and to border patrol. And then that may be coupled with really, really reactionary anti-immigrant changes to U.S. asylum and humanitarian parole laws. This is all in one package, one piece of legislation that contains all of these horrific priorities that are totally out of step with public opinion.
Oh, you're muted.
Walter, sorry about that, guys. It was recently reported, Walter, that the Biden administration is basically warning Ukraine that they're going to cut the funding off at some point soon. What's going on there? What are the details there? Is that actually happening? Or is it just, empty rhetoric? I'm never sure with this stuff, because you also have U.S. officials running around saying Israel's doing everything it can to avoid civilian casualties, and we're encouraging them to keep doing that. Meanwhile, that hasn't happened. It's only gotten more lethal to be in Gaza.
That's right. I mean, I think U.S. Policymakers are in a bind here because, on the one hand, they're frustrated with Ukraine. I think that the counteroffensive didn't pan out, right? I mean, we were told for months and months and months, the public was told for months, and government officials were told for months too, that Ukraine just needed a little bit more money, a little bit more time, and then they would blast through Russian lines and end the war. They would liberate Crimea, they would march on the Donbass, and the war would be over in this sweeping counteroffensive. But in fact, the Ukrainian armed forces have accomplished very, very little since that began in May or June. And so I think, we do see these sort of public expressions, or, maybe they're quoted anonymously in the media, expressions of frustration from the Biden administration, from the Pentagon, from the State Department. But at the same time, the U.S. government is still absolutely committed to its new Cold War policy with Russia and with China, right? The strategic, or this great power competition strategic doctrine. They know that if Russia does succeed in Ukraine, right, if the outcome of the war in Ukraine is perceived as a Russian victory, that would also be devastating to their long-term plans for domination of the entire globe. So I think that, we see these public expressions of frustration, but at the same time, a deep commitment by the Biden administration to keep throwing billions and billions and billions of dollars into this war, rather than spending it on, things that people actually need here in the United States or around the world. They're still committed to that because they know that the outcome would be so bad for them, essentially, if Russia were to come out of this being perceived as the victor.
Walter, there's kind of a deep irony in a lot of this to me in terms of how the Democrats are posturing, because on the one hand, with the anger that's coming, especially out of the Arab and Muslim community, with people saying that they are fed up and not going to vote for Joe Biden, the Democrats saying, well, immigration, Muslim ban, camps or whatever. But the irony I'm pointing to here is that it seems that this bill is 100% resting on its passing on whether or not the Democrats will agree to some pretty hardcore immigration measures, which to me seem to kind of add up to a lot of the things they claim people should vote for them to prevent.
That's right. I mean, the things that are on the table, according to reports, as the senators are negotiating with each other, are absolutely horrific. I mean, it would make the Biden administration's immigration policy even more indistinguishable than Trump's, maybe minus the racist rhetoric, although we still get a lot of that too. So the key thing, or one of the key things, is humanitarian parole. Humanitarian parole basically means that if you arrive in the United States and you apply for asylum, which is a guaranteed legal human right under U.S. and international law. If you apply for asylum, humanitarian parole means that under certain circumstances, you don't have to stay in detention. You don't essentially have to stay in prison while the while that case is going through the legal system, while a court is determining the status of your asylum application. A very basic baseline thing that you can do to treat people with the most modicum, like the smallest modicum of human decency. The Republicans want to end that, and the Democratic Party politicians may be so committed to the proxy war in Ukraine, they may be so committed to the genocide in Gaza, that they would actually agree to that. And say that, well, if you're applying for asylum, you have to stay in prison, and your whole family has to stay in prison too. If we add that to the fact that the Title 42 policy, which is what the Trump administration used to deny asylum to virtually everybody, to everyone who arrived at the U.S.-Mexico border, that's been replaced by another series of policies that the Biden administration came up with that effectively has the same effect. It's really a reintroduction of the quote unquote safe third country policy that Trump also implemented and was ruled illegal by the Supreme Court. If they do that and they end humanitarian parole, I don't know how the Democrats are going to go out on the campaign trail and pretend like they're any different from the Republicans when it comes to immigrant rights.
I mean, so listen, Walter, we've got people very angry at the Biden administration, right? I'm angry at the Biden administration. The numbers don't look good for them if they stay this way. Not trying to make this too much about horse race, but you see, and not to make it about lesser evilism, but it does seem like our choices are becoming increasingly between pro-genocide and pro-genocide more enthusiastically. I don't even know how to define it. What differentiates these parties at this point? They're all voting to fund the same wars. I mean, yeah, there's this handful of Democrats that are no, we support a ceasefire, and we don't, but it's inconsequential in terms of numbers. So what differentiates these parties at this point? They both lock people up and deport them. They both are very committed to Israel's genocide in Gaza. They're both very committed to, war with China. They're both, except for a few Republicans, they're both pretty committed to the war in Ukraine. What's the difference?
It's a really good question, right? I mean, I think that's a good way to put it. It's like genocide versus genocide with nastier words attached to it. It's so minimal, the difference between the two. I think you can make the same argument when it comes to economic policies. I mean, clearly the Democrats haven't done anything to alleviate the suffering of working people. On foreign policy, they have, saying that they have blood on their hands is an understatement. I mean, it's incredible, the atrocities, the slaughter that they've underwritten, that they've financed, that they've defended in public. When it comes to immigrant rights, like we've been talking about, very little to no difference. And I think that this is something that, the smarter people in the Democratic Party apparatus, machinery, the strategists are really, really worried about, because especially when it comes to young people, especially when it comes to Arab Americans and Muslim Americans, there's this growing sentiment. I think it's completely correct and righteous that we shouldn't reward the Democrats with our vote. If they're going to act like this, if they're going to wield their power to commit crimes of this magnitude, I cannot, in good conscience, many millions of people are thinking to themselves, I cannot, in good conscience, go out and vote for Joe Biden or vote for any other Democrat. And I think that's why there's a really big sentiment out there that we need to find progressive, left-wing, independent, third-party candidates to essentially to replace the Democratic Party, because lesser evilism is such a weak and uncompelling argument in the eyes of so many millions of people right now.
Walter, I was hoping you could talk about something you mentioned in the first answer, which is some of the trade-offs that are at play here when we look at this kind of spending. I remember when I first looked at the bill, it was I don't know if this will end up in the final bill, but they were proposing just over $1 billion for the Iron Beam, which is not even a real weapon. It's just an experimental laser weapon. And I just thought to myself, well, that really says a lot that we'll spend over $1 billion on an experimental laser weapon when the country feels like it's falling apart in so many ways around us. So, talk about that a little bit if you could, the sort of absurdity of what's already happening is they're passing a budget with a lot of cuts while adding a supplemental budget that's only for war.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at the official summary of this bill that was put out by the Democrats, by the people who introduced the bill, the language they use is investing in the defense industrial base of the United States. Investing in the defense industrial base, investing in the industrial base, that means subsidies to Boeing, to Lockheed Martin, to Raytheon, to all of the big war profiteering and genocide profiteering corporations. So while this is, it's true that this is money for Ukraine, for Taiwan, for Israel, it's generally delivered in the form of essentially gift cards, right? It's you can redeem X amount of money at U.S.-based weapons manufacturing corporations. It remains to be seen what this $14 billion of additional funding, how that'll be administered. But when it comes to the $3.8 billion of aid that the U.S. gives to the Israeli military every year, that is how it works. That's the legal mechanism, right? It's you can go to a U.S.-based weapons manufacturing corporation and spend up to $3.8 billion, and the U.S. government will cover the cost of that. And so, investing in the defense industrial base, it's a way for them to win on two fronts, essentially, right? The Pentagon and the State Department get their geopolitical, geostrategic benefit. And then their friends at the board of directors of these major corporations and all of the big banks that invest in these major arms manufacturing corporations get all of the benefits of the additional business.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead,
Were you
please.
going to say something? Oh,
Nope.
I was just going to ask you, okay, all this said, what do we do? That's a big question, Walter. What do we do?
It's a good question. I think that the mass movement in solidarity with Palestine is so inspiring. It's unbelievable how fast public opinion has changed, and also the massive way that sea change in public opinion is manifesting itself in the streets. So we had 500,000 people go to Washington, D.C. on November 4th to show solidarity with the people of Palestine. That gave birth to the Shut It Down for Palestine movement, where in hundreds and hundreds of cities and towns across the country and around the world, it's international in scope too, have had many international days of action to disrupt business as usual, to make it clear that there will be no business as usual until Palestine is free, until the genocide ends. The next day of action, by the way, is tomorrow for Shut It Down for Palestine. I think there's also, on a less massive scale, but still in a very real way, a movement opposed to the new Cold War, to U.S. Financing of the proxy war in Ukraine, to endless U.S. aggression against China, because clearly that is setting the world on the path to World War III, to devastation. So I think that for that movement to continue to grow, to mobilize, to become more disruptive, bolder, more militant, that's crucially important. And I think that is what's going to happen, and that gives me a lot of hope.
Walter Smolarek, editor of Liberation News, as always, thank you for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thanks for having me.
One interesting note on that point as we transition, Rania, it was the Financial Times actually was reporting that Benjamin Netanyahu is telling his advisors in the war cabinet that the protests in the Western countries are creating huge problems for them, making it difficult to do what they're doing. So I think speaks to the efficacy, which isn't always obvious on the surface, but when you get behind closed doors, it's clearly there. But to continue our conversation, we are very, very happy to be joined once again by Omar Badar, who's a Palestinian-American political analyst based in Washington, D.C. Omar, thank you so much for being back with us.
Of course, it's always good to be with you.
I wanted to get your thoughts on something I saw just a few minutes ago, a study that came out today. This is a report from Middle East Eye that 81% of academics in the United States who work on Middle Eastern issues have said they've been self-censoring on what they say about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or that's how it was framed in the article, because, they're afraid of being targeted. I mean, what does that say about the climate we're in? Because we're hearing, so much about, in Congress, the different things, rising anti-Semitism, and of course, we should all be opposed to anti-Semitism. I think that goes without saying. But nonetheless, it's almost like this is not even being told, this other side of the story here.
Yeah, it's an absolutely horrific and racist climate that really is the only way to understand it. It's a climate in which we are obligated, and frankly, rightly so, to be concerned about the lives of Israelis, but complete and total disregard for Palestinian life in a situation in which Palestinians are literally experiencing genocide at the hands of the Israeli government in Gaza. Massive massacres, deaths by the tens of thousands. We've crossed the threshold of over 7,000 children already, but that is not part of the conversation about safety. The only time we talk about safety is what slogan makes certain people feel what way on college campuses. It's completely insane. I mean, when you look at the numbers of people who have been fired, the number of people who have experienced violence as a result of standing up for Palestinian human rights. You have a 6-year-old who was stabbed to death. You have the 3 young men in Vermont who are wearing kufias, college students who were shot because of it. It is an incredibly anti-Palestinian climate, and it is absolutely a climate in which people who want to cheerlead this genocide can do so openly. They have the backing of the majority of people in Congress and effectively the policy of this administration. And the people who are opposing the slaughter of thousands upon thousands of Palestinian children are the ones who have to say so quietly or anonymously or being careful about exactly how they phrase what they're saying. It's a completely insane climate in which members of Congress, we saw the censure today of Jamal Bowman. We saw it before with Rashida Tlaib. In the case of Rashida, for merely saying free Palestine. Meanwhile, members of Congress who are calling for a genocide in Gaza, saying flatten all of Gaza, describing all Palestinians as Nazis, nobody says a word about it. This is just part of accepted discourse. It is frankly, a frightening climate in this country right now. And it speaks volumes about how deeply entrenched racism remains. We talk about what happened to Native Americans, something in the past, as if it's history that the United States is ashamed of. And if it were to happen again now, of course, we'd react differently. But it is unfolding in Palestine as we speak. And the entire political class is completely supportive of this idea of obliterating and displacing an indigenous population. It's really shameful.
Ahmad, I have relatives whose names I won't say because they're all terrified right now. They're terrified of not just having their reputations destroyed or losing jobs, they're terrified for their own physical safety. So it's stunning to me when I see, it's almost like the more Palestinians are murdered, the more genocide Israel carries out, the more these privileged white people, frankly, in the US at Ivy League institutions, in boardrooms, celebrities like Amy Schumer, I don't know, whatever, we can name them all, the more they seem to feel unsafe. It's really shocking to me. I have one relative who is terrified to wear the keffiyeh right now because these 3 boys were murdered in Vermont. It's like up is down and black is white, and the safety of Arabs, obviously not just in Palestine or in the region, but the safety of Arabs in America is not being taken seriously at all. They are the ones who feel unsafe as far as I can tell. And they are being gaslit in an insane way into shutting up, basically, and prioritizing the feelings of people who support genocide. That's more of a statement than a question. I'm just very angry right now. But please feel free to respond to any of what I just said.
Sure. Look, thankfully, 2 of the boys in Vermont survived with relatively minor injuries, and one of them is unfortunately paralyzed, which is incredibly heartbreaking. But I don't think these things are unrelated. I think that we live in a climate in which the more obvious Israeli crimes become, the more natural outcry there is about the extent of the horrifying violence that we're witnessing. You have the opposition coordinating these efforts, trying to pass resolutions equating anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism and whatever else. It is absolutely an effort to distract from the overwhelmingly horrific violence that everybody's watching on their screens. It is as if that us witnessing that violence is a threat to a particular narrative and a particular set of policies that people on the other side go insane to try to shut down the conversation about it because they can no longer win the conversation on merit. It's been just an avalanche of lies by the Israeli government trying to justify precisely what they're doing right now. And it is frankly incredible that even in a climate in which media coverage is absolutely horrific, and even when American policy and the entire political class is pursuing absolutely disgusting policies from left to right, you have a majority of Americans still supporting a ceasefire. That really speaks volumes about the horrors of Israeli policy, that even in the face of such shielding and cover that we're witnessing in the United States, people can still see through that bullshit and can tell that this is a policy that nobody should be supportive of and that this killing has to come to an immediate end. There is no world in the universe in which we can justify the massacring of civilians by the tens of thousands in the name of security. That just does not add up. Unless, of course, your position is openly that the lives of Israelis matter and the lives of Palestinians don't, which appears to be the policy of the Biden administration and much of Congress. That is the reality.
No, it is the reality. It almost, you feel through the looking glass. It's like, I've started calling it the leak industrial complex. I feel like every day I open the news and I see some quote, from some U.S. official, well, we're telling them to do less of this. Earlier today, they were saying, we told them it should end in weeks instead of in months. And all these things that seem to be speaking to the fact that they recognize that, 66% of people think that they're headed in the wrong direction, at bare minimum, but they continue to do it. I guess Rania already spoke to it. It seems like almost a gaslighting coming out of the White House with the way they're describing this. But I guess the point I'm making is, I guess I know the answer to this question, but I think it deserves to be said. Do they deserve any credit here? Because they're obviously trying to distance themselves from the worst of the worst with these leaks that they're giving to every newspaper.
Yeah, and it's incredibly weak what they're currently offering that they're trying to get applause for. It is Biden and Harris and the defense secretary getting on TV and saying the civilian casualties are unacceptable. It's too much. Israel must do more to minimize civilian casualties. And Israel responds by massacring more civilians. On the day that these statements were made, the next day, Israel killed more than 700 Palestinians in a 24-hour period. So the message from Netanyahu to these statements is, go to hell. We don't care what you have to say. And then our government's response is to keep sending them more bombs. So frankly, these kinds of pronouncements are completely hollow. And it's a little bit of Netanyahu kind of having a read on the political climate in the US and knowing that Biden will not go past a certain point because he knows he does not want to pick a fight with Congress, virtually the entire Republican Party, and even a majority of the Democratic Party that is backed by AIPAC over this issue. So they know that Biden has a line that he will not cross for his own domestic considerations. And it is our job to make sure that that balance shifts in the other direction, that the domestic consideration shows that this kind of support for genocidal violence that, that every person of conscience should have a minimal understanding of how this cannot go on and cannot be supported. If you want to continue down that policy, there has to be a price to pay. And we need to make sure that this price is actually paid.
You also have, I don't know if you saw this, I saw there's all these Israel lobbying groups from AIPAC to other more supposedly liberal ones are coming together to form some sort of October 7th like disinfo coalition to push against what they call disinformation about October 7th. I mean, maybe I'm reading too much into this, but to me it suggests that, these Israel lobbying groups work very closely with the Israeli government. That perhaps the Israeli government is trying to build some sort of apparatus to push for a long war. The Israelis are saying that they this could take nine months to a year. And it seems like, a couple months ago, I thought there would be a limit from the Biden administration. But so far, what I have seen repeatedly is they're saying no red lines. They're using zero leverage to get Israel to follow any of the so-called advice they've been giving them about minimizing civilian casualties. And we keep hearing there's a timeline, but the timeline keeps being pushed further and further. And we see there seem to be no red lines. Like the only reason Israel hasn't been able to push Palestinians in Gaza into the Sinai is because Egypt says no. The US literally went on a tour across the region to try to push for that. And now you see the Israelis saying they want to go after Lebanon. And you see America dispatching its officials to try to get the Lebanese to agree to ridiculous things that they're not even capable of enforcing, like pushing Hezbollah back to the Litani River. I mean, and just on and on and on. It doesn't seem like there are any red lines. You saw Matt Miller yesterday in front of the International Press Corps refuse to condemn Israel allowing premature babies to starve to death and leave their bodies to decompose for 17 days. I mean, I don't know. I'm starting to feel like maybe it's a little naive to think that the Biden administration has a time limit here. I don't know. Please feel free to push back against that. But at this point, so much has happened that I didn't think was possible that, I don't know if I can believe the idea that, there's 2 or 3 weeks left of this before Biden says no more.
No, look, I think you're right in the sense that I'm sure Biden would love for the slaughter to stop. The question is, what is he willing to do to stop it? And the answer is very little. He's willing to privately, in conversations with a genocidal, racist, lunatic government, privately tell them, can you please cut this out? And when the answer is no, then what? And that seems to be the situation we're stuck in. The answer is no, and Biden is not going to do anything about it. There's almost irony in the fact that the Israeli government wants to put together a response to misinformation on October 7th, when in fact the Israeli government was the biggest spreader of misinformation about the events that unfolded on October 7th. They were caught lying about it over and over and over and over. And then when you get to the point to where maybe there is a bit of overreach on the other side of people pretending no atrocities were committed, I think that is a bit of an overreach. But frankly, the people to blame for that is the government that has been spreading lies about it. You can't blame people for distrusting some of the details that are emerging, given the fact that they've lied so extensively about 40 beheaded babies. Turns out there were not even 40 babies killed, period, let alone beheaded. Talking about all kinds of inflammatory details of babies being put in ovens and whatever else. And it is quite clear and transparent that all of that was aimed at providing cover to what Israel is doing in Gaza. And I want to be very clear about what Israel is doing in Gaza, because liberal discourse in the United States suggests that what Israel is actually doing is trying to kill Hamas, and inadvertently they're forced to kill so many Palestinian civilians because what else are they going to do? This is the only way they can actually get it done. But in reality, Israel's goal is the destruction of Gaza and its civilian population. This is not a byproduct of Israeli policy. This is Israeli policy. They've alluded to it many, many different times, talking about, the population of Gaza should know that the gates of hell have been opened on them, talking about how accuracy is not really important. Their emphasis is on damage. The statements are just quite numerous about the fact that this is what they want to do. And it's Israel's mentality of what deterrence actually means. What they mean when they say deterrence is that anytime an Israeli is killed, the recipe for Palestinians is you have to live imprisoned, confined, without rights. We can take your land whenever we want to. We can bomb you whenever we want to. We control every aspect of your life. And if you ever respond with violence, we're going to kill so many of you that you're going to regret that decision. That is the Israeli recipe for how it treats Palestinians. And acting as if Palestinian civilian casualties are an inadvertent accident of Israeli policy is incredibly naive, when it's quite clear to anyone who's been following this that Israel's goal is the destruction of Palestinian civilians in what in their empty, idiotic minds think is an act of deterrence, when the history shows that every time, the more violent they've gotten with Palestinians, the more violent the response has gotten, because this kind of violence and genocidal destruction of huge areas and the denial of water, this creates the very despair and frustration and resentment that produces people who want to take up arms and fight back by any means. And if we're going to get to a situation in which if Israel took the security of its citizens seriously at all, the obvious road to a more secure society in the future is one in which Palestinians can live free lives on their own land with their full human rights, because that is the only way you're going to lead to a situation. You need minimal justice in order to move to a situation in which peace, a meaningful, long-lasting peace, can be a possibility, and that is not how the Israeli government is heading right now.
No, I appreciate that very much. As always, Omar Badar, Palestinian-American political analyst based in Washington, D.C. We really, really appreciate you giving us some of your time here in the Freedom Center.
Thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate it.
Rania?
Well, Eugene, I just wanted to let our viewers know that today we heard from, or actually yesterday and today, we heard from the Israelis. First, yesterday, the Israeli defense minister said that the campaign in Gaza is sending a message to Hezbollah. And I'm quoting Yoav Gallant, who, by the way, gives off Nazi vibes. I'm just throwing that out there. Just go look at him and tell me he doesn't look like a Nazi. But Yoav Gallant said, every person in Lebanon can take the map, the aerial photograph of Gaza, place it on an aerial photograph of Beirut, and ask themselves if this is what they want to happen there. Furthermore, you have Benjamin Netanyahu today saying that he's threatening Lebanon, that he's going to turn basically Beirut into Khan Yunis. And I guess, that should give us some solace, because as we've been told by many American spokespeople for the State Department and the Pentagon, Israel is going to great lengths to avoid civilian casualties in Khan Yunis, despite the fact that the murder rate has gone up drastically. So I just want to throw that out there. This is a genocidal, lunatic country that is not only carrying out a genocide in Gaza, is literally threatening its neighbors with further genocide, destruction, murder, whatever you want to call it. And again, this is going to continue until the U.S. puts a stop to it. The only power in the world that has the ability to make this stop is the United States. So if you are American and you are watching this program, it is literally like on Americans to make this stop.
Well, very good point. Very well taken point. And I think that, speaking of the region which you alluded to, for those who are, well, if you weren't thinking about Yemen before this conflict, I think you certainly are now, because of the strong support for the Palestinian people we've seen from the Yemeni people. And to discuss this further, we are very, very happy to be joined here by Jehan Hakim, who is the chair of the Yemeni Alliance Committee. Jehan, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, really great to have you here. And I guess the first question I wanted to ask you is maybe to speak to a little context for this. I think a lot of people have seen, in many different variations, from huge demonstrations to other things, a lot of support from the Yemeni people for the Palestinian people. I mean, what's behind that? What's the history of that? What's that connection? How's that rooted?
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. I mean, I think I want to first of all mention that Yemen is a sovereign state. So there's no other power that dictates or control how they operate. I think onlookers are commending Yemen rather for stepping in, even though Yemen is still fractured, still struggling from a brutal war backed by Western powers. So the plight of Palestinian people has always been a concern for the Arab world as a whole for decades, ever since the inception of Israel as a settler colony. But solidarity is rooted in centuries worth of Arab identity, Arab and Islamic history. For years, Yemenis from all walks of life, ideologies, and political affiliations have poured into the streets, marching and calling for a Palestine free from Israel's systemic annexation, apartheid, erasure, and to what the globe is now witnessing as a collective before our very eyes is a televised genocide, or some have even called it the second Nakba. I think the real question is, why has no other power intervened to alleviate the suffering of the Palestinian people while Israel continues to violate human rights laws daily? And that's why Yemenis stepped in.
You know, there's a lot of speculation about whether or not Yemen's actions in support of Palestine could derail the potential for peace with Saudi Arabia. How do you see that issue playing out?
I think we heard a week ago from Saudi Arabia after Saudi nationals criticized Malik bin Salman. He called on countries to seize arms exports to Israel, right? And then just yesterday, we heard Saudi Arabia urging the U.S. to exercise restraint after Yemen's actions. So derailing a peace deal with Yemen is not in the interest of Saudi Arabia at the moment, especially not for the sake of Israel. Saudi Arabia has wanted out from Yemen for a while, and this is their chance to de-escalate and step back from the aggression on Yemen, a war that they weren't winning anyway. It's the Biden administration that continues to support Saudi Arabia, selling billions of dollars of weapons to them, continuing to pressure Saudi Arabia to normalize relations with Israel. And when it comes to, the aftermath of Yemen's action here, I think what we can really, what the U.S. is telling us just a few days ago, the U.S. military said, and I quote, "Consider all appropriate responses. And these attacks represent a direct threat to international commerce and maritime security." Those are pretty scary words. There's a lot of fear being incited here, in which we know that fear sometimes can be used to justify violence. It can be interpreted as even war language, right? So the only powers that pose a threat to peace in Yemen would be Israel and its BFF in Washington, who since 9/11 has militarized every aspect of its foreign policy.
While we're on the subject, I want to just raise this because I think obviously prior to October 7th, the phrase was out there that the, war on Yemen was the world's worst humanitarian crisis. So I was hoping you could just talk for maybe those who weren't paying close attention to it. I mean, what has Yemen really been enduring in this Saudi and UAE and US and UK backed war that's been waged for a number of years on it?
Thank you for asking, because I think that's until today, nobody really understands or can fully grasp. And just really quickly, a history lesson. In March of 2015, Saudi Arabia, under the leadership of Malik bin Salman, who was newly appointed as the prince at the time, with the United Arab Emirates and its coalition of war partners, began launching airstrikes on Yemen, abruptly escalating a civil war into a regional inferno. The coalition bombed targets from border stations, shelling from the sea. Yemen's tiny military base was obliterated early on by the Saudi-led airstrikes. And since the start of the intervention, the U.S. has offered logistical, intelligence, and arms support to the coalition under the leadership of Obama. And that war support continued under Trump, and Biden continues to sell arms to Saudi Arabia and the UAE, despite his promises during his campaign to end the role of the U.S. in the war on Yemen. And the U.S.-made bombs actually have targeted hospitals in Yemen, schools, school buses, weddings, has disabled Yemen's internet service, causing a countrywide blackout. A slew of war crimes, right? And I think an aspect of the war on Yemen that receives very little attention and is still currently in place is the blockade. 9 years later, the coalition imposed a naval, land, and air blockade on Yemen since the conflict began in March of 2015, which severely restricted the flow of food, fuel, and medicine to civilians. So not only does the U.S. enforce this, but it also actively denies it. despite investigative reports and eyewitnesses. And a blockade is an act of war, right? So just really quickly, what it looks like when it comes to the impact, 8 years of war directly killed over 150,000 people in Yemen. But that toll climbs at least up to 400,000 when including the indirect consequences, such as famine, the disease. 85,000 children under the age of 5 years old starved to death. So the impact is great.
And given the strong support for Palestine among Yemenis, how, if at all, do you expect this could further shift the internal dynamics between the various factions opposed to Ansarullah, which is more well known in Western media as the Houthis?
Yeah, like I said, the Palestinian cause is a cause for all Arabs, especially for the people of Yemen who have always stood for Palestine. It has never been a partisan issue. I remember myself while I lived in Yemen growing up hearing chants by elders and children calling for a free Palestine. All factions inside of Yemen condemn the genocide of Palestinians. And we believe it's been 60 days and 75 years. This isn't a position that only Ansarullah hold. I think external dynamics are the real issue. Efforts led by Yemenis in the diaspora who are trying to collectively punish Yemenis and are calling for aid cuts into Yemen. There are also discussions, renewed conversation about designating the Houthis or Ansarullah as FTOs or foreign terrorist organizations, which Biden revoked right after Trump made that designation on his way out. After several independent NGOs and advocacy groups have called this move as a countdown to catastrophe.
Well, and let me also ask you this, for those who are watching, especially here in the United States, which is so complicit, but also the UK, other places where we have viewers. I mean, is there a place, people can find out more about what's happening in Yemen, but maybe more importantly, if they want to take action, having heard what you were laying out about the blockade, about potential sanctions, where they can look or find to get engaged?
Yeah, please follow us on social media. There are quite a few Yemeni American women actually that are leading this movement. And you can follow the Yemeni Alliance Committee on Twitter, Instagram. You could also follow Dr. Aisha Jum'an, who leads Yemen Relief and Reconstruction Foundation, who's not only trying to rebuild Yemen on the ground, but they're also part of advocating for an end to the U.S., the role of the U.S. in the war on Yemen.
Mm-hmm. Jahan Hakim, chair of the Yemeni Alliance Committee. We really, really appreciate you joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you for having me.
Rania?
Well, Yemen has been the surprise repeatedly throughout this entire genocide, I think, to a lot of people, and has showed a level of support that is pretty incredible, and has managed to what they've done is incredible. They have disrupted the ability for ships to move through a very, very important waterway. And as a result, it's actually affecting, obviously, not just Israeli ships, which are the ones that are, being directly attacked, but now the insurance on all ships is going up. And it's causing, I know people who work as risk assessment analysts for various major companies. That's a huge industry. And this has become a big thing that they've had to do risk assessment for, is because of how much this is affecting the cost of international shipping. So I think it's really important to recognize that, on top of the fact that it's interestingly enough, the Saudis were basically we're not touching this,
Yeah.
which I thought was quite fascinating. I'll go ahead. What do you think about that?
Yeah, no, I think it's a notable point. Just the fact that at one point yesterday in the morning, I wake up and I'm hearing all this there's going to be this big new naval thing and it's going to involve everyone and America's going to lead it and Saudi Arabia is going to be involved. And by the end of the day, it was we're not quite clear what the composition of this is going to be and perhaps it's not going to happen. I think it's an important point that you made. And, the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, which you have previously mentioned, which basically, if you go look on a map, it's the waterway that goes between Yemen and Eritrea to get into the Red Sea, to go through the Suez Canal. The only other way to get the goods into Europe and other places through the Mediterranean is to go all the way around the Cape of Good Hope, right? So all the way around Africa. Africa. So that gives you a sense of the added cost that would have, going from India all the way around Africa as opposed to going through the Suez Canal. And as I always try to explain to people, you remember when that ship got stuck in the Suez Canal and what a big drama that was. Oh, yeah. It gives you a sense of how much of the world's commerce, I'm not going to state a percentage because I don't have it in front of me now, but a very significant percentage that's going through there on a daily and a monthly basis. And Yemen has now disrupted that. And it's also worth noting that the U.S. National Defense Strategy, the number 2 goal for the region of the Middle East and West Asia is to prevent people from being able to disrupt what's happening in the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. So it gives you a sense of how strategically important it is. And of course, Yemen is also launching the drones at Iliad. And I saw a Politburo member of the Yemeni government, of the party that leads the Ansar Allah, say yesterday on Twitter, he said, how far from Iliad is the Dimona reactor, which is Israel's, domestic civilian nuclear reactor that provides a lot of its, electricity and things like that. So the Yemenis are not backing down whatsoever. I was reading some, one of these like rabid anti-Iran, pro-Israel analyst talking to some sort of, off-brand magazine that's like about the region. And he was saying, a lot of countries, they're afraid to retaliate because they don't want to be bombed. But, Yemen, they don't care because they've already been bombed for decades and decades and decades. So they're ready for it. So you have to say, it's. I think there's a reason why they have become so beloved around the Arab world, what's happening in Yemen and around the world, because, I thought Jahan put it well. This is, why isn't anyone else stepping in? That's what a lot of people feel. The slaughter is so bad, and this small, poor, blockaded country is willing to risk everything. They'd had some of the sanctions removed. They're risking putting them back on. They're risking being bombed. They're risking being even more blockaded just to do something to try to aid the people of Gaza. And I think that we know for an absolute fact that it's entering into the mindset of many of these other governments, that the longer it continues, the more they're going to have to worry about what's happening there. And one thing I'll also note is that the ship that you're seeing now, they took over in the helicopter, the Galaxy Leader, has become a bit of a tourist attraction. I think it's in Hodeida Port. I actually saw some guys take their graduation photo on the deck there. So some interesting social media content from that one. But nonetheless, I think that, Yemen in many ways is exemplifying the, deeply rooted aspect of the Palestinian cause in many communities and many countries around the world, where, people want to take action. They want to do something. They want to do what they can, really. So interesting to see how it develops, but no doubt about that. As another Houthi Central Committee member said right after they took the first ship, until the end of the slaughter of Gaza, every Israeli ship goes around the Cape of Good Hope. So, nonetheless, a form of material support there, Rania. But on that note, let's turn to our next topic, which is another form of support for the Gaza people coming out of the grassroots around the world that has been very, very impressive. And that's the effort to keep Gaza connected during these, very frequent communications blackouts imposed upon the people of Gaza. And we are very, very honored to be joined here for this conversation by Mirna El Helbawi, a writer, a journalist, and the founder of Connecting Gaza. Mirna, thank you so much for being with us.
28, during the first blackout of the communication and internet access in Gaza, I was trying to provide into the humanitarian aid organizations in Gaza through Starlink, the company of Elon Musk. He posted on X that can provide connection and internet access to them. And I tried to connect with the Egyptian Red Crescent and to fill the request on behalf of the Palestinian Red Crescent to provide internet access. And it was all in vain. All the attempts to internet failed, and I got surprised with a post from Elon Musk talking with one of the generals in the occupation army, telling him that he will not provide access to Gaza unless he gets the permission of US and US and Israel. So I was really frustrated, and I was keeping up all the updates on my social media account on Instagram with my followers. And one of my followers, she's Egyptian Lebanese and she's living abroad. She said, can we use eSIMs to provide internet to them? I was like, I used eSIMs during my last Euro trip, but I'm not sure if it can work there. Maybe can you send me like 2 eSIMs and I will just give it a try. And she sent the 2 isms right away. And I kept calling on X to see and to find anyone in Gaza who has like a weak or slight connection. And I found 2. Journalists, Ahmed Madhoun and Hind Khudari, and I sent them the isms, and they successfully installed the isms on their phones, and that was the moment when Connecting Gaza was born.
It's really incredible what's been able to happen. I mean, these are some of the few people that have been giving the world a view of anything that's been happening inside of Gaza. And it's incredible that it's still working. I mean, these are people who've become household names. You mentioned Hind, have become household names around the world in many ways. And I'm just curious, at this point in time, it does seem like the Israelis are obviously trying to limit the outside world's view of what's happening inside Gaza. They seem to be hunting journalists. It's becoming increasingly frightening. And I'm just curious, the people you're in touch with, what are you hearing from them? I mean, it just seems to get more devastating by the day. And Israel does seem to be going after those who have access to these sorts of things.
We connect thousands of people in Gaza every day, and we hear thousands of heartbreaking stories every day from people in Gaza. I was connecting a girl yesterday, and I was assisting her step by step to activate her ISIM. And once we were done with the activation, and it was successfully done, and I was ending the conversation, she texted me, "Can you stay online with me to talk with me about anything, because there are bombings near me and all my family got killed and I am alone and I feel very scared." And it broke me down, really. And I kept being online with her, and I kept texting her until the bombings ended, and she was like safe to sleep and to start her journey to the displacement to Rafah next day. So every day we come across some heartbreaking stories, like one guy a Palestinian who lives abroad, and he was trying to provide an ISIM for his sister in Gaza, and we were trying to connect her through him, and the internet connection in Gaza is very bad and very weak, and it keeps disconnect every 2 minutes. So it interrupts the whole process of activation in ISIM. And one time when I was waiting for him to get back to me, he told me, "I no longer need the ISIM because my sister got killed. Her house got bombed minutes ago." These are the kind of stories we hear every day in Connecting Gaza. We hear heartwarming stories of people who can connect with their families after days and days of not being able to hear their voices or talk with their loved ones or even reach hospitals. We even connected with journalists who could their videos and their and sharing the truth of what's happening on ground to the media platforms around the world. But the heartbreaking stories we keep hearing and we keep coming across every day is definitely heartbreaking.
One of the things I think that's connected to this that's important, I mean, I think, it's maybe well established, people have a right to water, a right to food, a right to housing. But I think the right to be able to stay connected, to use the internet, to be online, I mean, how important is that when we're also talking about the things that people in Gaza are being denied?
I cannot believe that we're almost in 2024 and we are not acknowledging the communication and internet access as a basic human right, just like food, medicine, and clothing. So this frustrates me a lot because, hey, guys, we're in 2024. Everyone uses internet, and the communication and being able to communicate and being able to call someone and being able to be with the outside world become vital, very vital, especially during the conflict zones. And it's very alarming that in 2024 as well, an occupation or an entity can simply turn off the whole communication and internet access on 2.5 million people. This is crazy that someone has this kind of powerful weapon and powerful tool to just keep killing people in silence and keep them disconnected and not being even able to share what's happening to them.
It's also, you're a journalist, and this conflict has been, I think, the most lethal. I'm sorry, I should say this genocide. I don't know why I even use the word conflict. I don't know if genocide really describes what's happening in Gaza. It might not be strong enough, but this horror show, this nightmare, has been the most lethal for journalists possibly ever. I mean, I don't know, you can correct me if I'm wrong on that, Eugene, but I think I saw someone saying more journalists have been killed in Gaza are journalists, and they're doing that work while they and their families are being hunted.
I think targeting journalists in this genocide is being intentional because this genocide or war, this specific war, is so different than the other wars and the past wars. We have the social media weapon, which is being used in a very strong way to share the truth on what's happening on ground in Gaza. And I don't think social media has played this huge and important role in conflicts before. So I think the Israelis were terrified from sharing all what's happening and from sharing the truth through the journalists, and definitely blocking and cutting off the communication internet access was a powerful weapon, so they can avoid the journalists and they can prevent the journalists from sharing the truth with the social media and the media platforms as well. So I think it was intentional. I think 81 journalists so far have been killed in Gaza since the start of the genocide. This is not normal, and this is definitely not unintentional to kill 81% of press members. Even today, we had a very heartbreaking scene from North Gaza. One of the journalists was among people and civilians who were arrested and arrested in North Gaza, and I don't know, they took them and they somewhere, I don't know, we don't even know if they're being executed, if they're being arrested. We have no idea where are they now. But seeing the horrific scenes from North Gaza today, and among these people there are journalists who the Israeli say these are people from Hamas. I don't think journalists are being with Hamas.
No, it's unbelievable scenes. People, stripped down, who knows, being taken away in trucks. I mean, some of the scariest things that I think, you can see. And I agree with you. It seems dubious that it's anyone but just average people. But that's this battle for information and why, of course, they want to stop people from getting it out. So it leads me to perhaps what maybe is the most important question here, which is, for those watching around the world, what can they do to help the efforts of Connecting Gaza?
We're still receiving thousands of eSIMs every day. We are connecting thousands of people every day as well. We will keep connecting Gaza until this genocide ends. If anyone wants to help, they can purchase an eSIM from any of the providers and send the QR code on our official email, gazaesims@gmail.com, and we will provide eSIM to someone in Gaza.
Mm-hmm. Well, we will be happy to try to get that information out more. Mirna El Helbawi, writer, journalist, and founder of Connecting Gaza. We really, really, really appreciate you giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm. Rania?
Wow, Eugene. I mean, it's just amazing what people have to go through just the stories she just told are horrific. This shouldn't be happening. Mm-hmm. Why is this happening? Every single day, I can't fathom how it can get worse. Yep. And then it does. It's I saw this image yesterday. It was a video of these kids, these toddlers just playing. and then like in Gaza, inside a house, and then the shelling hits one of the walls, and you just kind of see them disperse chaotically, really scared, screaming and crying. You know, that's one. I saw this other video of the inside of a hospital, and Eugene, it looked like an apocalypse. It looked like an apocalypse. People were being treated with these horrible open wounds on their bodies on the ground of a hospital floor. There's blood everywhere. There's kids screaming for their parents who've been killed, whose faces are bloodied, who've survived some sort of horrible massacre. I mean, you see these images, these videos of Israelis dancing and mocking and signing shells and calling for genocide and quoting the Bible to do it, and making fun of Arabs and making fun of Palestinians having no electricity and no gas and no food, and drawing unibrows and laughing and dancing and singing. Children are doing this. Israeli children are doing this. This is a society that has been consumed by genocidal hate. And the only thing standing, there is nothing. The only thing standing actually in the way of them and the complete extermination of all Palestinians is the fact that Palestinians resist. That is the only thing standing in the way. And while we're watching this is a televised genocide. It's a televised genocide happening every day in real time before our eyes. And we're being told by the most powerful countries in the world that we are anti-Semites for opposing this horror, for opposing what you're seeing right now on the screen, which is a bunch of men who, as far as I understand, were taken from nearby sites of refuge. People were sheltering in, I think, a school and other facilities. And they took the men, stripped them, and humiliated them, and then took this video. And we don't know what's happened to these people. We don't know what's happened to these people. We don't know if they've been executed. There's speculations that executions have taken place all across northern Gaza in various spots. But we don't know because people can't go there because the Israelis have made it a place where nobody can survive. This is an extermination camp. This is an extermination camp. The Israelis want to kill everyone they possibly can in Gaza. And that is what they are doing every single day. And then we are being constantly gaslit and told that we're anti-Semites, that we're bigots, that we're the ones who support genocide because we want Palestinians to live. Literally wanting Palestinians to live is considered pro-genocide by people sitting in the halls of power in the US. It's insane, Eugene. It is absolutely insane. I just don't even know. This has been going on for 2 months now and we're exhausted watching it. Imagine being there. Imagine being in Gaza, a place where over half of the population is children. Israel's at war with children. It's actually not even appropriate to say they're at war with children. They are, because the children can't fight back. Yep. They are massacring people in hospitals, in schools, in shelters, in their homes. They have displaced 85% of Palestinians in Gaza. 1.9 million Palestinians in Gaza have been displaced by the Israeli genocide taking place there. And we're not even allowed, it's like my relatives in the US feel scared to say what's happening because they're under attack if they do. What is this hell?
Yeah.
That's my rant. I don't know what else to add.
No, I think it's well put. I also just want to mention Dr. Salmiya, of course, the director of Al-Shifa Hospital, who we interviewed here on this show, was also taken by Israeli forces. And as far as I've seen, no information about what's going on with him. Allegedly, he was being quote unquote interrogated. But I mean, these are the types of interrogations that they're not really interrogations to learn anything. It's to get people to say things that they can then trumpet out for their propaganda apparatus. So I'll just say I wouldn't believe anything you hear from anybody who's been taken by Israel who later comes out, and is saying anything negative, or the hospital was Hamas or something like that. I mean, to me, it feels highly, highly prejudicial in many different ways. But yeah, Yeah, definitely notable. And this is another story that, of course, has evolved over the course of the day. Is when it first came out this morning, it was these are all Hamas fighters. But that, of course, collapsed very quickly, and it's become clear that these are just, random people off the street, and they took them to see if any of them may, in some cases, potentially be a resistance fighter. So they have no idea who they are, but they've just taken them captive, humiliated them publicly. And since part of the way we know this is not who they said it was, is people recognized them and said, actually, I know that person. They've now been publicly humiliated, and hopefully worse is not happening to them. But I think it's highly, highly possible. So, we're seeing a lot of intensity and increase in fighting over the course of this day. It's only going to continue to get worse until it stops. But we shall see, what takes place in the coming days, and we will do everything we can here on Breakthrough News to cover it the best we can, and with as many voices from the ground and as many analysts around the world to help us sort through it. So, it feels a little ridiculous to say this now, but, we really would appreciate it if anyone could go to patreon.com/breakthrough news, become a patron, become a donor. This is what keeps us going, allows us to do various different things, go various different places to get the story where it really is and to bring it to you week to week. So we'd appreciate anyone, patreon.com/breakthrough news, becoming an ongoing donor. And we want to really say we appreciate all of our guests today, as always, all of you who watched, all of our existing patrons and one-time donors, and anyone who's ever assisted us in any way, shape, or form. It really is greatly appreciated here as we continue to do what we can to break through the media blockade on the genocide happening in Gaza, the ongoing ethnic cleansing happening in the West Bank, and the overall apartheid system in so-called Israel. With that, we will bring this show here to a close. We'll be back with you next week. So for myself, for Rania, for the whole Breakthrough News team, see you next time.
Revolution knows no compromise. Revolution overturns and destroys everything that gets in its way.